Today's daf is Eruvin Daf Kavav. Today's shiur is sponsored by Gary Zeitlin in memory of Dr. Alexander Glassman, Zichrono Livracha, a dedicated family man and anesthesiologist who recently passed away at the age of 107. And in memory of Leah Ziering, Leah Bat Mazal, on her yurtzeit. Okay, we're going to start from 4 lines from the end of Kaf Hamud Bet. We're going to start, always fun, having stories about the Reish Galuta, the exilarch, and interesting things that go on in his courtyard. We'll see. This is going to be in his backyard. Hahu avarnka dehavale l'reish galuta bebustine. He had an orchard. That's the bustine. He had an orchard, and in the orchard there was an avarnka. Okay, what exactly an avarnka is? Different opinions. Seems to be some sort of dining pavilion. Okay, where people would hang out there. They would congregate. They might eat there. Okay, some sort of banquet hall, you could call it. So he had the following thing in his orchard. You can see in the pictures in the back of the Gemara, or whatever, in your picture book. For me, they're in the back of my Gemara. There's 2 different pictures of it actually here, where here in one picture, it's kind of in the middle of the orchard. Okay, we're going to see that they're going to erect mechitzot. Okay, we'll talk about which kind. So here in this picture, in 159, there's just a lot of different opinions here about what exactly they did. They surrounded it, okay? What we have is, it seems like the avarnka maybe was a beitza atayim. Some people say that it was actually a tree that kind of went out and shaded an area that was a huge area that was a beitza atayim in and of itself, okay? And then instead of erecting something around it in this picture, they erected from the house a pathway to the orchard. Okay, so we'll see this inside right now, but I just want to tell you that it's unclear exactly how this went about, what exactly they did. Amar Rav Huna bar Chinina. So Rav Huna bar Chinina says, Le'ave Marta Kant. I'm sorry, he says to Rav Huna bar Chinina, the Reish Galuta comes to the rabbi, right? Even though he didn't always have the greatest relationship with all rabbis, he always had a resident rabbi who kind of did stuff for him. So he goes to Rav Huna bar Chinina. If you remember, in the previous story, it was Rav Nachman, because Rav Nachman was his son-in-law. In this case, he goes to Rav Huna bar Chinina. Li'avid marta kanta de lemachar nochal nahama. Please fix this for tomorrow. It's Friday now. It's relevant. We're learning this for at least some of us on Friday. And he says, I want to be able to bring food out here on Shabbat. I want to be able to carry to it. And what's the problem? So again, it's a little unclear, but let's assume it's bigger than a beitza atayim. Okay, it's a large space, and it has walls around it because it's in his property. But the pavilion was erected after he had already put the walls up. So at this point, this is a classic case of the walls were put in, and then you put in the pavilion. So when it was originally put up, it wasn't for the purposes of this living space. Azal amad kaneh kaneh pachot mishlosha. So he put up, right, the easiest way to erect a fence is not to build a whole fancy fence, but to put in reeds with a distance of less than 3 tvachim between them. Laws of Lavud, they're viewed as if it's a solid mechitza, and he built this wall. Again, either it's around it, or maybe it's making a path, and other pictures have it like on the side. I think in the Schanstein they have a picture where it's in the Koran, where there's the pardes is on both sides, and then they erect this pathway, kind of separating it from the orchard that leads to this pavilion. In which case, what are we basically doing is we're making a wall. Now it's like erecting a new wall, like we saw in the previous cases. If you erect a new wall, then you can call this hukaf l'dira. But something interesting happens. Azal Rava comes along. He obviously disagreed with this and thought that there was no reason to do this. Now, you can disagree, and okay, you have your opinion. But Rava decides, and this is just like Rav Sheshet, if you remember in the previous story with the Reish Galuta, he's going to take action. This isn't necessary, and I want to show everybody that this isn't necessary. Okay, shalfinu, and he pulls it down. Okay, if you remember the previous story, what happened? Rav Sheshet pulls down the lechi, and then it turns out he was wrong. Well, the same thing is going to happen here, which is fascinating in terms of these rabbis who maybe just got very worked up about the Reish Galuta's house and wanted to say, oh, you're doing that wrong, and wanted to make a big stink about it. And in the end, they end up proven wrong. Okay, so it's very interesting, right? And as Gita pointed out right now in the chat, which is something I was also alluding to, which is the Reish Galut is a very public place and everybody sees it. So the rabbis often want to make a scene here. They want to make a statement. I want everyone to know that this is not necessary, okay? So he didn't think that you needed to fix this kind of a space. And not only did he pull it down, but he sent, and maybe these are, you could call them his henchmen. They're not exactly their rabbis. They weren't exactly his henchmen, but like the other story, remember he sent his shamash? So here, Aza, Rav Papa, Rav Huna, Bered, Rav Yoshua. It's unclear if Rava sent them or they decided on their own because they were together with Rava. Naktinu mi batre. They took them away so that nobody could re-erect them. They'd have to start collecting new reeds and re-erecting a new fence. And therefore, they made sure that no one was going to put the fence back up. It's a little bit strange, this whole story, and it becomes even more strange when you see what happens. L'machal eitive Ravina l'Rava. Now it gets to Shabbat. And now Rava took them off and said, basically, you can carry. It's not a problem. Comes Ravina, and he starts questioning. Okay, so tomorrow comes, you can imagine the scene. They're all about to bring out the food, and when push comes to shove, sometimes people start questioning. And not only is Ravina, who wasn't part of the story before, going to start questioning, but there are going to be 3 questions. Questions number 2 and questions number 3 depends a little bit on your version that you have here, but most of them, the version that we have in the print says, number 1, well, this everyone agrees with. Rav Papa then comes and questions himself. Remember, Rav Papa and Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua were the ones who took away the reeds. Now they come back and they start questioning themselves, and this is very common where somebody does something. And then this happens in my house all the time. We kind of make a decision about something that's coming up later. And then when you're about to do it, you start questioning, oh, do I really want to do this? And, why did I commit to this? Or you start questioning when it's actually in your face. So all of a sudden the rabbi starts saying, maybe this really is an issue. And maybe we really do need to construct this fence. So here come the 3 questions. Eitive Ravina l'Rava. So first, like I said, Ravina comes. Eitive means he's going to bring a Tanaitic source. The other 2 are not going to be Tanaitic. They're Amoraim, but here he brings a Tanaitic source. Ir Chadasha Modidim La Miyeshivata. This is all about Eruv Tchumin. When you are allowed to go out of the city limits, 2,000 amot, we always say the city limits. What constitutes the city limits? Is it the wall of the city? Often you have a wall, but there's no houses near the wall. So do you count from the last house? Or do you count from the wall? So it depends whether the city is a new city or an old city. And then we're going to have to define what does it mean new and old. So if it's modidim la, if it's yeshana, modidim la, ir chadasha, new city, modidim yeshivata. You measure from the last house. The yeshana, but an old city, mechomata, from the walls. Ezohi chadasha ve'ezohi yeshana. Chadasha shehukfa ulevasof yashva. Chadasha, a new one, is one that was surrounded first with the wall, and then after you settled in it, which means that we can't count this wall as the wall of the city because there were no houses inside before. So if we take an old city that had a wall, but now we built houses, those houses, now what Rava seems to have thought, which is interesting, he thought this, that if you have something that's meant for dwelling purposes, and you surrounded it with a wall before it existed, right? Which is what we call hukaf ulevasof yashav, and afterwards he built it. He seemed to say, that's okay. Here we have something that's meant for settling, for living in, sort of living, and that's going to be the other question about this. Is it really meant for living? Not really. And it was hukaf, it had a machitza, so he thought that was okay. So they say, what are you talking about? This goes based on it has to be that the wall was there first, even though this is a little different, but the wall was considered, right? If the wall, this is for Tchumim, but it's the same idea. If the wall existed first and then you put houses in, then that's considered new. And that you cannot count from the wall. It's all about the city, right? That where there's houses. So that's like our case. You can't consider this a wall that was hukaf l'dira if the dira came after. And Yeshana, what's an old city? It's going to be the opposite, obviously. Yeshava. First it was settled. That's why it's an old city. Ulevasof hukfa, and the walls came after. V'hainami, and our case is kuhukfa ulevasof yashvadami. Our case was that the Reish Galut had this pardes that had a wall around it, and afterwards they built the pavilion. So because of that, it's it's going to be considered that the wall doesn't really count. If the wall doesn't really count, well, then we need to erect a new wall. And that's exactly what they tried to do yesterday. And he basically says, I don't know why you took the wall down. Amar le Rav Papa le Rava. Okay, this is a bit of a strange, there's some complications about the sugya. Rabbeinu Chananel actually has a different reading that Rav Papa is responding to Ravina, and he has a different girsa, but I'm going to stick with that there's 3 questions here, and the second one was asked by Rav Papa himself. As we said, Rav Papa was one of the people who took away the kanim in the first place. So now Rav Papa says to Rava, wait a minute. He starts to rethink. He says, V'hama Rav Asi, didn't Rav Asi say, Mechitzot adrichalin lo shmei mechitza. Alma. Kevan delitzniuta avida lo havya mechitza. Hachanami kevan delitzniuta avida lo havya mechitza. Now he's going to say, whatever, now again, it's a little bit unclear what walls we're talking about, but he's saying the pardes has walls here. I assume he's talking about, even if you're going to say these walls work, these walls are not walls that are good walls. Why not? They're like mechitzot of adrichalin. What are adrichalin? These are workers. When workers work in a building site, what do? Okay, this happened in my house yesterday. I had workers in my backyard, and it was a brutally hot day. Anyone who's living in Israel knows how brutally hot it is right now. And if you live in Ranana, all the more so. Brutally, brutally hot. And they come to work, and I was shocked that they came to work because it's really, really brutally hot, and I had to work outside. And they basically, in the midday, I come outside, and I see they put up this whole schacha, like an overhang to protect them from the sun. This is exactly what they're talking about, right? There's where mechitzot, it's like a ceiling. But what did they do? It was a very temporary structure, right? It was gone by the end of the day. They didn't leave it up. It's a very, very temporary structure. It goes up, and it's just really there to block out the sun. And the Gemara calls it litzniuta. Litzniuta. They want to block. They don't want people watching them doing what they're doing. They just want a little bit of privacy while they're working. So that is a very temporary mechitza, and it's for the purpose of tzniuta, just to block from people looking in. And therefore, that's not a real mechitza. This mechitza around the pardes is the same type of thing. Okay? Again, becomes a little bit unclear. How is it exactly the same type of thing? In the Reish Galuta's house, what, it was temporary? Or maybe so here they seem to be focusing less on the fact that it's temporary, more so on the fact that it's just there for blocking off people from looking in, but not really for people to be living there. So therefore, this mechitza doesn't count as hukaf ledira, because it's not that kind of mechitza. And thirdly, Amar Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua, and here you see there's an aleph. The aleph sends you to Hagahot Bach, who says it was Rav Huna and it wasn't Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua, but let's just assume it was Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua. Then it's the same character as before, and it also makes a little sense because then I assume you'd have to change, according to the Bach, you'd have to change the continuation, because then it says, the ha'amal Rav Huna, doesn't Rav Huna say, it would be weird for Rav Huna to be quoting himself, so I don't exactly understand the version of the Bach, but in any case, let's assume Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua says to Rava, but didn't Rav Huna say, mechitza asuya lenachat, lo shma mechitza? Didn't he say that if you make a mechitza just for nachat, now what is nachat? It could be either for resting, or it could be for putting items. Nachat is to put down. Could be for placing items and storing some things. And that space of the pavilion wasn't meant for living purposes. It was just meant for nachat. They would leave some things there. They would, maybe some clothes, maybe some other items, maybe some utensils that they wanted to eat with. That place is just a place for leaving things. It's not really a place for living. And don't we know that when you make a mechitza for purposes like that, it's not a mechitza? How do we know this? The city of Mechoza didn't have walls. Okay, Rava Baravua made an eruv for the city of Mechoza, part by part, meaning he didn't make one eruv for the whole city. He did it by sections. Okay, it seems like the city of Mechoza, you can see here, was strips of houses with mavois attached, and all of them, there's a picture in the Gemara there in Rashi. They were kind of rows that went from Rishut Rabim, like from one side of the city to the other side, kind of these rows. We'll talk about what was in the rows in a minute. And then it was kind of like strips of houses, road, strips of houses, road. And the road was totally open to the Rishut Rabim. So he didn't make the whole city one eruv, because he didn't think that any of the inner mechitzas that existed counted as mechitzas, because all of them were asuyim lenachat. So basically you had a city without any walls around it, and you had a city without mechitzot, that the mechitzot inside, which we're going to talk about in 1 minute what they were, aren't considered mechitzot. since they're not considered mechitzot, each area was viewed separately, and you couldn't use the existing walls in any way. And therefore, if that proves that all the walls that were in the city didn't count, the fact that you had to make these separate eruvs in each area. So now, what were these mechitzot that existed? Mishum pera de beitori. Again, many different interpretations what exactly this is. Rashi says it was ditches. Tori is shvarim, the oxen. There were these deep ditches in between each neighborhood that went right into the ground. There, according to Rashi, they would put the garinei tzmarim, the food that the animals would eat, the pits of the dates, for the I don't know why they were eating date pits, but for them to eat. And then he says, and there were no walls, and these mechit, right? It didn't have a wall around the city. It didn't have these didn't count as mechitzot, even though technically speaking, they were like mechitzot because they were 10 tefachim deep, 4 wide. So theoretically, it should have worked. But he said, these are mechitzot. They're like mechitzas that were meant for putting things down in, not necessarily for separating. So because of that, we're going to have this issue. Okay, so because of that, what does it prove? That a mechitza that's done around something that's meant for placing items. Some people say actually the oxen would go into these ditches, but for placing either people or items or things like that, but not for dira purposes, not for living purposes. Again, this is all a question. Where you draw the line, what's considered living, what's not. So therefore, it's not going to work. So number one, you did it in the wrong order. Number two, even these mechitzot, right? This doesn't help because this is a space that the mechitzot shouldn't, right? These are mechitzot that are not the right type of mechitzot for what we need. So basically they knock out Rava for these 3 reasons. And now we go back, we zoom in on the Reish Galuta, spotlight on him. What's his response to this whole situation, right? You know, Reish Galuta was not always fond of all the rabbis. And here comes his big line, Chachamim hema lehera, ulehitiv lo yada'u. Okay, here he quotes a verse from Yirmiyahu, and he says, these chachamim, they're smart enough to mess things up, but they're not smart enough to know how to do good, right? How to fix things. So here, very nice, you created such a problem, and now it's obviously Shabbat, and there's nothing we could do about it, and we're stuck. Okay, so interesting the situation that we had here. Okay, moving on. Now, if you remember, okay, it's hard to remember, this is a while back, when we discussed our Mishnah, we're now going to finish the parak because we're getting to the very last part of our last Mishnah. We had this statement of Rabbi Eli that he said, very interestingly, I heard the following things from Rabbi Eliezer, 3 halachot, right? One very related, one semi-related because it has to do with Eruv, Chatzerot, but not exactly our topic. And the third about Maror on Pesach. And he said these 3 things I learned from Rabbi Eliezer, but I couldn't find anyone who agreed with me about them, right? I tried searching and I couldn't find a friend who heard the same thing from him. So now we're going to discuss his 3 opinions. Okay, we're now assuming, the sugya is kind of reading it as if this is Rabbi Eliezer's opinion because we're really reading it through Rabbi Eli's eyes right now. Not necessarily that we agree that this is the case, but that's how the sugya is reading it, as if, you know, we believe that Rabbi Eliezer said it right now. So he says, Shamati me Rabbi Eliezer afilu beit kol. What does this mean? That a karpaf, remember, until now we keep saying a karpaf has to be up until a beit sa'atayim, where you can plant 2 se'ah of wheat or crops, and any bigger, it's already not going to be allowed to carry in this space. We're going to call it a karmelit. It's a big open space, even though it's not open, right? It has a mechitza, but since it wasn't hukaf l'dira, right? Then we've talked about different ways you could fix it. You can make the space smaller. You can, right? You can do all sorts of things. But the basic case is once it's bigger than that, you can't carry in it, right? More than 4 amot, like a karmelit. So he says, no, even a beit kor. Beit kor is 30 se'ah, so 15 times the size. It could even be 15 times the size. That's the maximum size. It could be much bigger. But nitin de lo kechananya. Our Mishnah must not follow Chananya. Detanya, okay, we keep going back to this Chananya, right? We had it in Shabbat. We had it here just a few days ago. Chananya omer. Afil detanya, as the Braita says, Chananya omer. Ba'afilu hi 40 se'ah. Ki istartia shamelech. Even if it's 40 se'ah, like a big courtyard of the king. Okay, the court of the king is very large. It's called an istartia. Okay, that we're now going to say, according to him, it can even be as big as that, which we're going to say is 40 se'ah. So now they're going to say that, by the way, the machloket, okay, we'll read it inside for a second. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ushne mikra achad darshu. Hananya and, who is it? And Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Eli, both come from the same, they both basically agree on the concept. They just disagree about what the amount is, but they both basically learn it from the court of a king. And we basically say it could be as large as the court of a king. As long as it's as large as the court of a king, the whole question is, how large is the court of a king? Is it 30 se'ah or is it 40 se'ah? And where did they derive this from? From an interesting story in Sefer Melachim. I'm going to read you a few of the verses inside and translate. In Sefer Melachim, Bet, the second book of Melachim of Kings, in chapter 20, it says, Bayamim ahem chalach Chizkiyahu lamut. Chizkiyahu was sick, he was going to die. Vayavo elav Yeshayahu. Yeshayahu comes to visit him, Yeshayahu the Navi. And he says, K'amar Hashem tzav lebeitecha ki meit ata v'lo tichya. You're going to die from this disease, basically. You're sick, you're going to die. Vayasev epanav alakir vayitpalel el Hashem lemor, an Hashem zechoria asher talachti lepanecha be'emet v'levav shalem v'atov b'einecha asita vayev Chizkiyahu bechi gadol. He starts to pray to God, and he starts crying. And it says, Vayihi Yeshayahu lo yatsa. Now here comes the tricky part. It says in the verse, Ha'ir hatichona, and it says there's a kriyuch tiv. That means it's written one way, but there's a tradition that it's read differently, that it's read chatzer and not the ear. Okay, so I'll translate. And Yeshayahu hadn't yet gone out to, meaning he was on his way to go out to the chatzer hatichona, the inner courtyard. But instead of saying inner courtyard, it says inner city. Okay, so you can see where this is going. They're going to say city and courtyard are the same. Okay, and that's how we get to their measurement. And then Dvar Hashem comes to him before he even gets there, right? He's about to go, and God speaks to him and basically says, okay, I heard your tears, I heard your prayers, you're going to be healed. You will not die. Okay, that's the story. So now they say, so Yeshayahu lo yatzar chatzer tichona, ktiv ha'ir ukrinam chatzer. It says the city, it's written as the chatzer. Mikan li'istartia shamelech, I'm sorry, it's read as the chatzer. Mikan li'istartia shamelech shahayu ka'ayarot benoniyot. From here we learn that the size of the court of a king was like the size of an average city. B'mai plige, what's the machloka between them then? If they both agree it comes from there. Mar savai arot benoniyot havya beit kol, umar savar ba'im se'at. There's just a debate about how large the courtyards were. How big the average city is. Is the average city that you could plant 30 se'ah or 40 se'ah? That's the debate between them. Now they want to just, once they got into the story, they want to know, and they're going to teach us something else from here, kind of interesting. Yeshayahu, my bai hatam, what was he going, right? What would you expect Yeshayahu to do? You would expect him to walk out the front door, right? He did his thing, gave his prophecy, and let's leave. But instead it says he was about to go into the inner courtyard. Why was he going to the inner courtyard? What was he doing there? So he set up a yeshiva there. Why did he set up a yeshiva? Because what's the best way of avoiding the malach hamavet? We know this from the story of David HaMelech. If you remember, we learned it, I believe it was in Brachot, where he basically learns and learns to avoid the malach hamavet. He knew he was coming, so he just learned, and then he tripped on a step, and for a second wasn't learning, and he dies. So likewise, he said, okay, I guess Chizkiyahu either wasn't in the mode of learning or he wasn't in a state of being able to learn. So he brings and he sets up a yeshiva, which you think is a good thing. Okay, we're going to see it's a little bit troublesome, a little bit problematic. So he sets up a yeshiva, and that's why he went into the courtyard where he set up this yeshiva. Mikan l'tamid chacham, from here, what can you learn? If there's a tamid chacham shechala who's sick, what do? Sounds like a great idea. Shivin yeshiva al pitcho. Okay, you set up a yeshiva. But the Gemara says in a very interesting manner, lav miltahi. But this is really not a good idea. Why? Dilma ati legiruye be satan. You're basically enticing the satan. Okay, why are you enticing the satan? Seems that, okay, there's different interpretations here. Rashi says, it's actually in parentheses, there's some issues with the girsa. In other words, when does the Satan come? We know this happens all the time. When does the Satan come, or the Shadim? Whenever we talk about evil spirits, they always come when you're doing something that could lead to problems, right? Where the Satan has a way to come in, he'll come in, okay? So it's like water, right? You have water issues. This is why I'm doing work in my backyard. So if you have water issues, what happens? The water basically finds somewhere to go, right? If you have a crack, you have some sort of opening, it will find where to go. It's like that with the Shedim and with the Malach HaMavet. If you let him in a little, he will come in and that's the end of you. So what happens here? When you're learning, there's a lot of dangers in learning. So one of the interpretations is Rashi, who says learning causes fighting between people. And sometimes the fighting, we've seen this before, there was inner fighting. And again, this is the rabbi's way of kind of criticizing, being self-critical of what goes on in the Beit Midrash. Sometimes the fighting is dangerous because if you fight with each other and it crosses the line between, respectful fighting and non-respectful fighting, well, then the Malach HaMavet is going to come in and that's the end of it. So that's one option. Another option is that he could get to you in the sense, it's dangerous not in how you might behave, but what the result might be. What could happen, what could result dangerous if you're basically going to a place where the Malach HaMavet is there because someone's sick, the Malach HaMavet is hanging out, and he might come and attack your learning. What could he do to attack your learning? He'll make you make mistakes in your learning. And that's also very dangerous because when you're Talmidei Chachamim and you're learning and you make mistakes, it could be problematic to come out with all sorts of mistakes. So because the Malach HaMavet is around, it could cause problems in your learning and the result of what you're doing might be problematic. Not that the actions are, right? There's always issues relating to actions and issues relating to results. This is more, right? Either the actions are problematic or the result might be problematic. You'll make mistakes. Okay, that was just an interesting aside about the dangers of Talmud Torah, okay? The dangers either of the actions of how you learn or of the effects of what might come out. And second thing he heard, remember, we have a scenario, we have a chatzer, everybody went in for the Eruv, they put food together, and they put up their lechi, but one, or not even, it could be not shituf mavot, it could be just chatzerot, and as long as, right, there's enclosure. Anyway, what happens now? One of the people didn't join. So what do? We say, let's say it's me, I didn't join. So I just say, listen, you can have my property for Shabbat. And then my property is canceled. I don't own it anymore. And therefore it's ownerless kind of thing. And you're all basically a part of it. The question is, can you carry into my house though? Did I give up my house or did I just give up the use of my outside section, right? My chatzer, my courtyard. So if you remember, what did Rabbi Eliezer say according to Rabbi Eli? That the beito asur, I can't carry from my house outside or from outside into my house, but other people can, right? I'm kind of penalized because I didn't join the chatzer, but other people can because I gave up my reshut to them. So they question that and they say, "V'hatnan, doesn't it say in the Mishnah, beito asur lahotziu lachnis lo vilahen? My house is forbidden not only for me, but also for anybody else because I didn't join." So, and when I said you can have my property, I was really just saying my courtyard, not my house. How? What, you think I gave up my house? So, Amar Rav Huna Bered Rav Yoshua, Amar Rav Sheshet. Remember who this is? Okay, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, says in the name of Rav Sheshet, Lo Kashya, Ha Rabbi Eliezer, Ha Rabbanan. Don't question Rabbi Eliezer from a Mishnah. We could just say that Mishnah held by the rabbis, and he holds like, right? This is his own opinion, right? The rabbis think everyone's forbidden. Rabbi Eliezer thinks, no, people can come in. Kishatim Silomer. Now, if you want to look more deeply into this, let's try to understand what's behind what they're saying. Kishatim Silomer. If you think about it more, what do you see? L'divrei Rabbi Eliezer, what's going on here? Hamivatel reshut chatzero, reshut beito bitel. When you say, I'm giving up my property, you mean it wholeheartedly. You mean all of my property. This is what we call ayin yafa, generously. Okay? You basically say, yeah, everything is yours. L'Rabbanan, but the Rabbanan's approach is not that. Hamivatel reshut chatzero, reshut beito lo bitel. No, I wasn't giving so generously. No, people don't just say, oh, take my house. Right? Not the easiest thing for people to give up. My courtyard, I could say, oh, I'm giving up my courtyard. I mean, obviously this whole thing is somewhat fictitious, but even so, the rabbis say, people don't go so far as to say, take my house, their house, they invested a lot in it. They don't just give up their house. What he meant just was his courtyard is more ba'ayin mitzumtzam, right? More limited. So the Gemara says, Pshita, what you're saying is totally obvious. Why do you have to say when you think about it more? What do you mean when you think about it more? That's obvious that it's either, right, he was generous about it or he wasn't so generous. That's obviously the machloket. So Amar Rechava, now this is the point that we're going to now have two versions. In the first version, it's really the same, both versions. It's just, did someone else come in and try to explain what we said Rav Sheshet said? Or the second version is going to be Rav Sheshet himself was quoted as saying this. Ana Rav Huna, Bar Chinina, Targimna. Rechava says, me and Rav Huna, the son of Chinina, who was the guy in the Reish Galuta's house from the beginning of the Daf. Lo nitz Targina, we explained. Lo nitzcha ella, what he's trying to say is that this is connected hand in hand with another machloket about this topic. That's basically our case. 5 people in a courtyard. One of them didn't join the Eruv. Now, if we assume he does this generously, then we assume he means it wholeheartedly, which means that it's enough if he just says to one of the people in the Chatzer, I give you permission to be in my courtyard. We assume he means it generously, and he means all of them. So he doesn't need to go to each individual and say, I cancel my reshut to you. So we're going to assume that machloket is connected with this one. That since Rabbi Eliezer says he's very generous, it means he can just go to one of them, and that's fine. Rabbanan, but to the rabbis, since he's not so generous about it, and he's really only giving up his courtyard, he has to go to each person in the Chatzer and say, I'm giving you permission to use my property. And then they say, Keman Azla. Now, this is very obvious, not really sure why they're asking, but according to who does the following Braita hold by then? Once we say this, maybe this was sort of what their goal was to get to this question by saying this was, according to who does the following Braita hold by? Titania, and this is obvious at this point now that we got to here, exactly the case we just described. He doesn't need to go to everybody. According to is that Braita, what they're basically saying is that was the whole goal of what he was trying to show. According to this Braita, go, Kit Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, must hold like Rabbi Eliezer. Rav Kahana Matnehachi. That whole thing that we just learned from starting from Rechava was all Rav Kahana's version. Rav Tamyume Matnehachi, but he taught it differently. Keman Az Lahad Tanya. He started with the question, according to just following bright to go. Same bright we just quoted a minute ago, that you don't need to do that. You don't need to go to everyone. According to Keman. And then the answer comes from, right, it started as a question. The answer comes from Rav Huna Bar Yehuda Amar Rav Shesha. It's quoted in the name of Rav Shesha, and not other people that came to explain Rav Shesha, but that he himself said it. Keman Ki Rav Eliezer. Okay, that he says this matches that. Okay, now we're going to have another approach, which basically the Mefarshim say this clearly is a different approach, that that's not the reason for the machloka between them. Amar le Rav Papa la Abaye. Le Rabbi Eliezer I amar lo mevatlina, ule Rabbanan I amar mevatlina mai. What if the person says, okay, Rabbi Eliezer thinks that people do it generously, but what if he says, I'm giving you permission for my courtyard, but not my house? Then what do we say? Do we say, now let's see the two options, okay, and then we'll do the same thing for the rabbis. The rabbis assume that he's only giving his courtyard, not his house. What if he says, I'm giving you my house also? Would it work? Okay, now this is a fascinating thing because somebody actually says something, expresses it, but what they're expressing is different from the norm. So does halacha follow the norm? And we say you're thinking of the word in Hebrew, you're choleg mehanorma. You're basically you're differing from the norm, and therefore you're not anymore. We don't trust you. We don't think you really mean what you say. You're deviating. Thank you. You're deviating from the norm. And if you deviate from the norm, maybe if we assume the norm is such a norm and you're deviating, maybe there's really no meaning to what you're saying. Maybe you don't really mean it because this is what everybody does. And you must not be going against what everybody does. So anyway, interesting. Let's read. So what does he say? Here are the two sides. This is a classic case of how subjective can halacha get, number one. And also, when somebody says something, and this comes up in a lot of sugyot, and I find these the most fascinating, when somebody says something, do we assume they really mean what they're saying? Because sometimes people say things and they don't really mean what they're saying. So how do we know when they mean it, when they don't mean it? So it's a very interesting discussion. So he says like this, Tama, do we say, here's the first option, Tama de Rabbi Eliezer mishum de kasava, it's because he holds, hamivatel reshut chatzero reshut beito bitel. That if you're mevatel reshut of your chatzer, you're also mevatel the reshut of your house. But hi amar analom mevatlina. In other words, there's an assumption we make, but if you explicitly state, I'm not doing that, then we assume that we believe you. You're not doing that. O Dilma, or do we say, the Talmud of Rabbi Eliezer, and now this is not the reason we said before, that everyone's just generous. Maybe his reason is something else. And then according to this, we would say that it's different, and it wouldn't connect with the previous machloket about does he have to mevatel to everybody else, each person individually. Odil matam to Rabbi Eliezer mishum debayit belo chatzer lo avide inashe dedaire. A person can't live in a house without having a courtyard in front of it. Okay, and this you have to think about the way they live now in those days. There's no way anyone would live in a house without a courtyard. And therefore, Kika Amra, Loma Batlina, when he says, I'm giving you my courtyard, but not my house, he's creating a situation that no one in their right mind would ever do, because what's living in a house without having a courtyard? And therefore, Lav Kol Kamine, what he said was really nothing, and we basically ignore it. Af Agav da Amra Dayarana, Lav Klum Ka'amar. Okay, even though he said it, didn't mean it. Ule Rabbanan, so those are the two options. And now let's do it according to the rabbis. I Amar Mevatlina Mai, so if he says, I do give you rights to my house. Do we say, my tamid Rabbana mishum de kasavre hamavatel reshut chasero reshut beto lo bitel? We just make an assumption. Most people aren't being generous about it, and they're not going to give up their house. But hi, Amar mivatlina. But this person said, I am, and maybe he's just more generous than the average person. And then we go by that. O Dilma tamid Rabbanan mishum de lo avid inish de misalek nafshe legamri mibayit b'chatzer v'havik yoreach legabayu. No one would ever, in their right mind, give up their house and their courtyard. And yes, maybe your courtyard, but you're not going to make yourself a guest in your own house. You would never do that. And therefore, Haiki Amar Mivatlina, Lav Kol Kamine, Kama. He didn't really mean anything when he said it, because no one would ever give up rights to their house. So what do we say? And here comes the answer. Amale, Ben LeRabbanan, Ben LeRabbi Eliezer, Kevan de Gale Date Gale. Since he said it, we go by what he says. And we basically say he's different from the norm, and therefore we're going to basically go with what he's expressing. Exactly. What's really interesting here is we're basically saying all we want in general is to figure out what's he thinking. This person told us exactly what he's thinking. So obviously we're going to go by that. In the other cases, we have to use general principles of what we assume. We make assumptions. But here there's no reason to make any assumptions because he's telling us. So therefore, we're obviously going to hold by what he says. Last part for this parak. V'chein shamati mimenu sheyotzim ba'akrablim b'Pesach. My akrablin, Amarish Lakish, atzavta chorziyata. What's this? Okay, this doesn't really help us. Okay, what's this vegetable that they're discussing? This that you can use for maror? It's atzavta chorziyata. Okay, what does that come from? The root of charuz, like to bead or to go around, and atzavta seems to be fibers that grow around the palm tree. That's what they're saying it is, and that can be eaten for Pesach. Some people have it as akrav instead of arkav. Akrav is a scorpion, and it's shaped like a scorpion. Hadron ala chosim pasim. We finished the second parak. We're going to start now the Mishnah of the third parak. B'kol ma'arvinu mishtatfim chutz min hamayim u'min hamelech. You can use any food. Now we're going to talk about the food you need for the eruv. Rashi says we're talking about eruv chatzerot and eruvei tchumin. Tosfot says, interestingly, this can't be talking about Eruv Chatzerot. It must be talking about Eruv Tchumin to allow you to go 2,000 amas outside the city. Why? Because he says, if you look at Daf and Aleph, it says you need bread for an Eruv in the city. So you can't say Bakol Marvin. So Rashi would have to understand that differently. I'm just going to put it out there right now as a machloket. You can use any kind of food other than Mayim and Melach, water and salt. This is a fascinating discussion also about water and salt are not considered foods. And we're now going to see in a bunch of other areas. If you have Maaser Sheni, this is when you take in years number 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 of the Shemitah cycle, you take Maaser Sheni, you take another 10th after you take your Truma for the Kohen, you take your Maaser for the Levi, then you take another 10th and you bring it to Jerusalem. What do? You take your fruits, you redeem them onto a coin, you have to add an extra 5th if you're doing your own fruits, if you're doing someone else's, you don't. And then you go to the temple with this, you go to Jerusalem, and you spend that money buying, and now, according to the pasuk, you have to buy fruits, but we're going to see that the rabbis understood it not just fruits, meat, fish, all sorts of other things, and now they're going to say anything other than water and salt. Hanoder min hamazon, third category. Here again, it goes to what did you mean when you said, I take a vow I'm never going to eat food, or I'm not going to eat food tomorrow, not eating anything. Are you allowed to eat water and salt? So they say, mutar b'mayim v'melech. Okay, you can eat both of those. Ma'arvin l'nazir b'yayim, moving on to a different issue. You can use wine. If you're a nazir and you want to make an eruv, even though you can't drink the wine, you're allowed to use wine. So marvim l'nazir b'yayin uli Yisrael b'truma. If you're in Yisrael who can't eat truma, then you can still use truma produce. What's the issue with both these? They can be eaten by other people. So therefore, it's ra'oi la'achila. It can be eaten by other people, and therefore it's fine. Sumcha somer, he disagrees about one of them. The Gemara is going to say, why not about both? Bechulin, okay, he says it has to be chulin. It can't be truma. Can't use truma. Ula kohen bebeit hapras. Now we're going to talk about, this is not sumchus anymore. This is Tanakama. There's a debate whether he holds like sumchus or he doesn't. Talk very briefly about it. A beit hapras is a field where there were dead bodies underneath. There were bones. They plowed the land. So now there's lots of broken up pieces of bones. And it's a suffix tuma because anywhere you walk, you might be going over bones, you might not. So they say that a kohen can walk in a space like that, will basically just blow. And whatever bones there are, we're assuming have already come up above ground, and he'll blow them out of the way, and he won't be ending up walking on bones. So this says basically he can put his Eruv. We're now talking about not what foods you use, but where you place the Eruv. And that's why maybe it's not connected at all to Sumchus, because Tosfot says it's not connected at all, because this is an issue of, basically what he's saying is you can't go through a cemetery, you can't put it in a cemetery, but you can put it in a Beit HaPras, which is suffix tumah, because there's a way the Kohen can walk through there. So maybe this is like Sumchus, who says chulin. Some people think it's like that, where you have to be able to eat it, so you also have to be able to go there. Some people say, no, that's a different issue. This is an issue of you're in one place and your Eruv is in another place. That doesn't work. You have to be able to be in the place where your Eruv is, especially if we're talking about Eruv Tchumin. It has to be a place where you could say, this is where I'm living for Shabbat, even though you're not really fictitiously saying that. So you have to be able to go to the place. If it's in a place where you can't go, like a cemetery, of course you can. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, afilu ben hakvarot, or beit hakvarot, mipnei sheyachol lachutz v'lelech v'le'echol. Theoretically, a Kohen can go into a cemetery. How so? He can go in a box or in some sort of contraption that blocks the tumah from him, covered. He can go make like with walled lachutz, like a mechitza, and he can walk through and eat. In other words, if it's in between the graves, there's a way the Kohen can theoretically get in, which means that it's okay. Now, according to this, it would seem like most people think that he actually holds like Sumchus. It says, since he can actually get there, it's not a problem. Okay, and then it would be like the chulin. Okay, we'll stop here, obviously, because we're done, and we'll pick up with the Gemara tomorrow. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And we get to an interesting Gemara tomorrow, just so you know, for those who won't be listening, it's on Shabbat. I'll post later today, but we get to the sugya of the mitzvah shasman grama by women. We're going to get a little bit off on some tangents. It's always nice, the Gemara. You might be into Eruvin, right? And your head is all Eruvin. They always add in other interesting things, and we're going to get a little bit off topic. So, okay, and the zav though. So for your treat of mitzvah shasman grama, we're also going to get back into tumah and zav and his tumah. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone.